May 2016. A quiet announcement ripples through the medical world, but it hits with the force of a bomb. Theranos, the $9 billion darling of Silicon Valley, informs federal regulators that it is voiding 2 years of blood test results. Not a few dozen errors, not a bad batch. 2 years. Tens of thousands of reports delivered to real patients, telling them they had cancer or diabetes or high cholesterol, were suddenly retracted. In an instant, the medical history of thousands of people simply evaporated. How does a company valued higher than Uber, backed by Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, end up telling the world that its product effectively never existed? To understand this, we have to ignore the turtleneck, ignore the magazine covers, and ignore the voice. We have to open the box. Because inside the black box of Theranos, the laws of capitalism were trying to break the laws of physics. And physics fought back. The premise was seductive in its simplicity. Elizabeth Holmes pitched a future where the terrifying, archaic metal needle was obsolete. No more vials of venous blood. Just a finger stick, a pinprick, a few drops of blood collected in a tiny nanotainer. From this single drop, Theranos claimed their proprietary device, the Edison, could run over 200 distinct laboratory tests. It sounded like the iPod of healthcare. But there was a problem, a biological problem. When you prick a finger, you aren't just getting blood. You are rupturing cells. You are mixing capillary blood with interstitial fluid and tissue fragments. It is a dirty sample. In traditional medicine, this doesn't matter for a simple glucose check. But for complex chemistry panels, it is a nightmare. Holmes wasn't just pitching a smaller machine. She was pitching a reality where volume requirements didn't matter. She was betting $9 billion that she could change the fundamental chemistry of human blood. Why did no one stop this? Because Silicon Valley operates on a specific theology, the dropout genius. We want to believe that a 19-year-old from Stanford sees something the entire medical establishment missed. Investors didn't see a medical device. They saw the next Steve Jobs. They poured hundreds of millions into a black box they were never allowed to open. And this is where most people get the story wrong. They think this was a failure of technology. It wasn't. It was a failure of due diligence. It was financial negligence disguised as innovation. Before we tear apart the engineering, if you want to join the few who understand how money actually works, and how to spot the next fraud before it collapses, make sure you're subscribed. Because the mechanism used to fool these investors is being used right now in a different sector by a different company. Let's dig in. The tragedy of Theranos is not that rich people lost money. The tragedy is that this device was live. It was in Walgreens. Real people were making life and death decisions based on a machine that was essentially a random number generator. When you move fast and break things in software, you get a buggy app. When you move fast and break things in medicine, you get a patient with a false HIV positive, or a patient whose blood clots are missed until they have a stroke. By the time the dust settled, the $9 billion was zero, but the cost to the healthcare system? Immeasurable. To understand how they got away with it for so long, we have to look at the first lie, the microfluidic mirage. Let's go back to the lab in the early days. The vision was microfluidics, a legitimate field of science where you manipulate tiny streams of fluid on a chip. Think of it like a computer processor, but moving liquid instead of electrons. It's precise, it's elegant, and it's incredibly difficult. Theranos claimed the Edison was a microfluidic masterpiece. In reality, the engineering team hit a wall. The blood clogged the channels. The chemistry wouldn't stabilize. So they pivoted. They built a robotic arm inside a box. It wasn't a futuristic chip. It was just a miniaturized robot holding a pipette, moving samples around. The engineers called it the Gluebot, because it was essentially a hacked-together automated glue dispenser. It was clunky, it broke constantly, and it had zero temperature control. But when investors came to visit, the box looked sleek. It looked like the future. Here is the specific engineering flaw that doomed the Edison. Blood chemistry is temperature sensitive. If you are running an enzymatic reaction, a shift of 1 degree can skew your results by 10%. Standard lab machines are massive because they need insulation and thermal stability. The Edison was the size of a toaster. When the motors moved the robotic arm, they generated heat. The inside of the box would warm up unpredictably. The device was essentially cooking the blood samples while trying to analyse them. To fix this, you would need vents, fans, space, all things that ruined the sleek, compact aesthetic Holmes demanded. So they didn't fix it. Instead, they tried to fix the data. They wrote software algorithms to smooth the results, throwing out outliers until the numbers looked right. In science, that is called data fabrication. In Silicon Valley, they called it optimization. The people who actually understood the physics, the biochemists, the microfluidic experts, they didn't stay. They couldn't. When an engineer pointed out that the thermal drift was invalidating the assays, they were marginalized. When a chemist noted that the variation between Edison machines was higher than the medical standard allowed, they were fired. This created a Darwinian selection process inside the company. The competent, ethical scientists were purged or quit in disgust. Who remained? The yes men, the sycophants. The young graduates who didn't know enough to say, "This is impossible." Holmes built a culture where pointing out a violation of the laws of physics was treated as a lack of loyalty to the company mission. It was a hermetically sealed echo chamber where the only feedback allowed was applause. This internal rot had to be hidden from the outside world. To seal the deal with partners like Walgreens, Theranos needed external validation. They needed big names. Holmes circulated reports featuring the logos of pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer and Schering-Plough. These reports supposedly validated the technology. Investors saw the Pfizer logo and assumed Pfizer had tested the machine. They hadn't. Holmes had taken preliminary discussions, written her own positive conclusions, and slapped their logo on the header. It was a forgery, a literal copy-paste job. But it worked. Walgreens, terrified of missing out on the next big thing, bypassed their own lab consultants. They signed a deal to put these toaster-sized ovens into pharmacies across Arizona. The experiment was about to go live on the public. 2013, the peak. Theranos opens its wellness centres in Palo Alto and Phoenix. It is a masterpiece of branding. The centres feel like a spa, not a clinic. Calming music, bamboo, minimal aesthetics. Patients walk in, get a finger stick, and are told their results will be ready in hours. The stock valuation hits $9 billion. Holmes is on the cover of Fortune, Forbes, Inc. She is declared the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. But behind the bamboo walls, panic is setting in. The Edison devices in the back room aren't working. They are failing quality control checks daily. The mini lab, the next generation device, is even worse. They have patients waiting for results, and they have a box that generates random numbers. So, they initiate the greatest bait and switch in corporate history. This is the smoking gun. This is the mechanism of the fraud. Theranos secretly bought rows of commercial analyzers, standard massive machines made by Siemens. These are the workhorses of the industry, the exact machines Holmes claimed she was disrupting. But there was a catch. Siemens machines are designed for venous blood, large vials. Theranos only had the tiny nanotainers from the fingersticks. So, they hacked the protocol. They diluted the tiny samples. They took a few drops of blood and watered it down to create enough volume to run through the Siemens machine. In chemistry, dilution is dangerous. It dilutes the analyte you're trying to measure. It lowers the signal-to-noise ratio. It amplifies error. If you are looking for a needle in a haystack and you add 10 tons of more hay, the needle becomes invisible. They were running these hacked tests, obtaining garbage data and printing it on Theranos letterhead. The patient thought the Edison did it. In reality, it was a diluted sample run on a competitor's machine, operated incorrectly. Federal law requires a clinical laboratory to have a qualified lab director, a scientist who puts their license on the line to certify that the results are accurate. At Theranos, the lab director role was a ghost position. For a long stretch, the role was held by a dermatologist who rarely stepped foot in the lab. Later, it was filled by people who were bullied into signing off on protocols they didn't understand. Internal emails show lab employees begging for guidance. The results are drifting. The controls are failing. Sunny Balwani, the company president and Holmes's secret boyfriend, responded not with scientific inquiry, but with rage. He monitored keycard access. He tracked internet usage. He created a culture of surveillance where reporting a failing test was seen as an act of treason. The lab wasn't a scientific facility. It was a fortress protecting a secret. While Balwani patrolled the hallways, the data going out to patients was getting dangerous. A patient in Arizona received a result saying his potassium levels were critical, levels that should mean a heart attack was imminent. He rushed to the ER. The hospital ran a standard test. His potassium was fine. Theranos had simply got it wrong. Another patient was told she was miscarrying her pregnancy because her HCG levels were dropping. She wasn't. The Theranos test was just inaccurate. These weren't glitches. This was statistical inevitability. When you dilute a sample beyond its limit, you are guessing. Theranos was playing Russian roulette with patient health, firing out false positives and false negatives, all to keep the stock price at $100 a share. But you can only fight the data for so long. Enter Tyler Schultz. He had the perfect pedigree, the grandson of George Schultz, the former Secretary of State and a Theranos board member. Tyler joined the company fresh out of Stanford, expecting to change the world. Instead, he found the Gluebot. He found the Siemens machines hidden behind locked doors. He found quality control data that was being manipulated. In a normal lab, if a machine fails a QC check, you shut it down. At Theranos, they just reran the QC over and over until it passed by luck. Or they deleted the outlier data points. Tyler did the math. He saw that the proprietary technology had a variation coefficient way higher than industry standards. He tried to tell Holmes. She brushed him off. He tried to tell his grandfather. George Schultz, charmed by Holmes, didn't believe him. He sided with the fraudster over his own flesh and blood. Tyler Schultz realized he was the only sane person in the asylum. Let's look at the specific numbers that Tyler saw. The CMS inspection later confirmed this. In February 2015, the Newark lab ran a QC check on the Edison for testosterone, a basic hormone panel. The failure rate was 87%. Think about that. 87% of the time, the machine could not accurately read a control sample with a known value. For vitamin B12, the results were drifting so wildly that the acceptable range Theranos set was effectively useless. In the world of diagnostics, a coefficient of variation, or CV, should be under 10% for most tests. Theranos devices were showing CVs of 20%, 30%, sometimes higher. They were selling a ruler that changed length every time you used it. To hide this, They stopped plotting the data on standard Levy-Jennings charts, the industry standard for tracking errors. If you don't visualize the error, it doesn't exist, right? Tyler Schultz wasn't the only one. Erica Chong, another young lab associate, saw the same nightmares. Samples sitting at the wrong temperature, patient complaints being ignored. She quit. But she didn't just walk away. She filed a complaint with CMS, the federal regulator. And around the same time, a tip landed on the desk of John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal. Carreyrou was a healthcare reporter. He knew that one drop of blood defied the laws of fluid dynamics. He started digging. He called ex-employees. He called doctors. And Theranos went into war mode. They hired David Boies, one of the most aggressive litigators in the country. They threatened sources with bankruptcy. They had private investigators follow Tyler Schultz. They tried to intimidate the Wall Street Journal. They were fighting a media war to protect a scientific lie. This phase of the story is critical. It shifts from fraud to coercion. Holmes and Balwani were burning through millions of dollars in legal fees to silence whistleblowers. They forced employees to sign draconian non-disclosure agreements. They threatened to ruin the careers of 20-year-olds. Why? Because the valuation depended on the trade secret. If the world knew the trade secret was just diluting blood and running it on a Siemens machine, the company was worth zero. They weren't protecting intellectual property. They were protecting the ignorance of their investors. But they made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the regulator. You can bully a journalist. You can bully an employee. You cannot bully the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services when they decide to inspect your lab. September 2015. The CMS inspectors arrive at the Newark lab. It is a surprise inspection. Theranos tries to stall them, but federal badges open doors. What the inspectors find is a horror show. They find the Siemens machines hidden in the back. They find freezers at the wrong temperatures. They find untrained staff running complex validations. But the nail in the coffin is the data. The inspectors pull the raw logs. They see the 87% failure rates. They see the ignored QC flags. In January 2016, they issue a letter that contains the most terrifying phrase in medical regulation: Immediate Jeopardy. This means the lab's practices are so dangerous they pose an immediate threat to patient safety. This isn't a fine. This is a death sentence for a healthcare company. The jig was up. With the CMS report looming and the Wall Street Journal articles shredding their credibility, Theranos had to do damage control. But how do you fix 2 years of bad data? You don't. You erase it. In May 2016, Theranos informed CMS that it was voiding tens of thousands of test results generated by the Edison devices. Think about the mechanics of that. A doctor treated a patient based on a number from 2014. In 2016, that number is declared null and void. Did the patient take unnecessary medication? Did they miss a diagnosis? We will never fully know the extent of the harm because the data was simply wiped. By voiding the results, Theranos admitted that their proprietary technology, the entire basis of their $9 billion valuation, did not work. At all. The Edison was officially a paperweight. Where were the investors during this? The Waltons? The DeVos family? Rupert Murdoch? They had put in hundreds of millions. When the WSJ story broke, Holmes told them it was a conspiracy. She told them it was a hit job by the old guard, trying to stop innovation. And for a while, they believed her. Why? Because they didn't understand the science, and they had sunk cost fallacy. They had already bought the ticket. They didn't want to get off the train. But once the CMS report became public, the denial shattered. Partner Fund Management sued. Walgreens sued for $140 million. The board members, who had been asleep at the wheel, suddenly realized they were sitting on a liability, not an asset. The valuation was slashed from $9 billion to $800 million, then to zero. The final collapse wasn't financial, it was criminal. In 2018, the Department of Justice indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani on charges of wire fraud. The charge wasn't that they built a bad machine. Failure is legal in Silicon Valley. The charge was that they knew it was bad and sold it anyway. They lied about the capabilities. They lied about the pharmaceutical endorsements. They lied about the revenue. The trial revealed text messages between Holmes and Balwani that showed them scrambling to hide the failures while publicly projecting success. This wasn't a fake it till you make it scenario. This was fake it until you go to prison. The trial stripped away the black turtleneck image and revealed a desperate executive running a Ponzi scheme of information. January 2022, the courtroom in San Jose. The jury delivers the verdict. Guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors. It was a landmark moment. Silicon Valley executives rarely face jail time. But the jury was selective. They convicted her of defrauding the investors, the millionaires, but deadlocked on the counts regarding the patients. This is a bitter pill. The legal system found it easier to prove that Holmes lied to a hedge fund than to prove she endangered a patient. Why? Because wire fraud is about specific financial representations. Patient harm is messier, tied to medical causality. But the message was sent. You cannot lie about the physics of your product to get money. Holmes was sentenced to over 11 years in prison. The black box was finally closed. We need to analyze the mechanism of the deception one last time. How did she trick seasoned investors? She exploited the FOMO, fear of missing out, loop. She demanded money with conditions. No voting rights, no looking at the tech, decision required in 24 hours. She created an artificial scarcity. By framing Theranos as a military secret, or trade secret, she turned the lack of data into a feature, not a bug. If you asked for peer-reviewed data, you were out. This is a psychological mechanism known as the emperor's new clothes applied to venture capital. No one wanted to admit they didn't understand the microfluidics. So they all nodded, signed the check, and hoped someone else had done the diligence. They hadn't. The legacy of Theranos isn't just a cautionary tale for investors. It's a scar on the biotech industry. For years after the crash, legitimate diagnostics companies, startups with actual working technology, couldn't get funding. Investors were spooked. Is this another Theranos? Became the first question in every pitch meeting. The fraud cast a shadow over real innovation. And what about the patients? The thousands who received voided results? Most received no compensation. They were the collateral damage of a unicorn chase. Holmes goes to prison, the investors write off the loss against their taxes, but the trust in the medical system? That takes a decade to rebuild. Don't think this is over. Theranos is gone, but the incentive structure that created it is stronger than ever. Right now, in artificial intelligence, in green tech, in defense, companies are raising billions on black box promises. They claim proprietary algorithms that no one is allowed to audit. They claim breakthroughs that defy current physics. And investors are still lining up, terrified of missing the next Google. The mechanism hasn't changed, only the buzzwords have. The next Theranos won't be a blood company. It will be an AI company claiming sentience, or a battery company claiming infinite range. And the only way to protect yourself, whether you're an investor or a patient, is to demand to see the inside of the box. If they tell you it's a trade secret, run. We investigate these mechanisms every week. If you want to see the next one before it hits the news, make sure you're subscribed. The physics never lie. People do.